Good afternoon, everyone. I want to, on behalf of Water UCI and the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources here at University of California, Irvine, we want to welcome all of you to this webinar, which is a discussion with Senior Attorney and Senior Director for Water Initiatives at the Natural Resources Defense Council, Steve Fleischli, who's going to talk about the likely water resource priorities of the Biden administration. I want to alert you to some upcoming events, both with the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources and Water UCI together, and some separate events. Upcoming, Water UCI and the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources will have a water equity and security panel coming up this spring. Plans are ongoing. We'll certainly alert all of you when that is scheduled. Very exciting event that we're looking forward to. Water UCI will have an event on March 3rd that focuses on one family of contaminants of concern, PFAS substances, perfluoroalkyl substances, which are becoming ubiquitous in our public water supplies. So we'll send out an alert on that as soon as we've everything is taken care of on that, but it will be on March 3rd, and we'll let you know who the participants are. And the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources will have a conference on extinction, solution for species on the brink, February 9 and 10. So be alert to that. This is a webinar format. We have some pre-prepared questions that we're going to ask Steve to address. And then following that, we are asking all of you to please use the Q&A function, to submit questions that you would like Steve to address. And we'll go through these, and we will, time permitting, select as many of those questions as we can. So that is the format. It is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague from the Center for Land, Environment, and Natural Resources, who will also introduce our speaker today, Melissa Kelly. Melissa?
All right, thanks, Dave. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Steve Fleischli. As Professor Feldman mentioned, Steve is a senior attorney and senior director for water initiatives at the Natural Resources Defense Council. His team's objective is securing safe, sufficient, and affordable water for people and nature in a changing climate. His areas of emphasis include water quality, stormwater runoff, climate preparedness, California water policy, and the water energy connection. He has a long history of advocacy on water quality issues, both nationally as well as in Southern California. Steve has testified before the US Congress on water quality matters and co-authored briefs at the US Supreme Court. Prior to joining NRDC in 2010, Steve served as president of Waterkeeper Alliance, an international environmental organization supporting local watershed programs in over 300 communities across 6 continents. Steve was one of the first people I met when I was working in LA, and I've seen him speak in a variety of settings, from arguing before a judge to meetings with regulatory agencies to the more informal working lunch with colleagues. And what stood out to me was his passion for his work and how he fully invests himself in it. And that enthusiasm is infectious. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. And with that, Steve, let's talk about water policy and this new administration. So Steve, would you start by giving us an overview of this administration's first 15 days? The president has already issued a number of executive orders and made some important environmental appointments. What does this signal about the trajectory of the Biden administration's environmental agenda? Sort of set the tone for us before we dive into the water policy specifics.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And thanks, David, for the opportunity to be here today and to share my perspective. I really appreciate it. It's great to be connected with UC Irvine. You know, in terms of where things are, the last 15 days, I think you all can probably appreciate it's just been enormously busy right now. President Biden has issued, last time I checked, which was yesterday, 28 executive orders, many of which address environmental issues, including water. And on his first day, he issued a climate executive order, and last week he issued one as well. And what I was heartened by in those executive orders is it goes beyond climate. It really covers the full suite of impacts from climate change and brings water into the mix as well. I think You're seeing that President Biden is taking a very different approach than President Trump did. He's seeking to restore scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking across the government. And I will admit at the beginning of this talk, as you might imagine, I do have a certain personal perspective on things that I want to share here today. In terms of the executive orders, at a very high level, a couple things are important that stood out. He's directed his agencies to review all environmental actions taken during the Trump administration's tenure to see if they're consistent with his policies and consistent with the law. He's also asked the Department of Justice to seek stays in litigation that may be occurring against Trump rulemaking that took place during the Trump tenure, to review the underlying regulations that are being challenged in court to see if there's mistakes were made or if there's opportunity to rectify situations with the Trump rulemakings that don't align with either law or policy. I think you also see equity is front and center in the conversation. You see that in his cabinet appointments. You see that in the way he speaks about these issues. You see this in the way his executive orders are framed around environmental justice and equity. Really a vision that elevates equity, respect, and justice. And I think that tone is really very different than what we saw under the prior administration. The entire framing of the conversation is different. And instead of throwing up walls and denigrating science, I think President Biden is embracing diversity and the role of science, at least so far. You know, a lot of work needs to happen to build on what these executive orders and what the president's vision is. He's made some really big promises, and we need to hold him to it. It's easy to say big, important things, but to implement and act is a lot different. One area where I think it shows great promises in the political appointments he's made. Michael Regan with the Environmental Protection Agency to be the administrator. I don't know if folks saw his confirmation hearing yesterday. I thought it was, he did a really nice job. And he expressed that he was committed to at least 3 things: science, transparency, and environmental justice. I had the opportunity to meet Administrator Regan a couple years ago in North Carolina, and I was impressed by him. He's got a lot of hard work to do ahead of him. But I think he's a good person for the job, and he comes from a very difficult state. North Carolina, difficult from a regulatory context. It's a purple state, and he was able to make some good progress, and he was well received and well liked by the environmental justice community, and I think that's really important. And then in the area of water, specifically, the assistant administrator for water who's up for nomination is Radhika Fox, who comes to the EPA from the U.S. Water Alliance. She has a very strong water utility background. She used to work at the SF Public Utilities Commission. She's very strong on water infrastructure investment. She's a very good convener and consensus builder. And I think that will serve her well in this role. She's focused much of her career recently around COVID relief, long-term water affordability solutions, climate issues, environmental justice, and equity. She understands the water infrastructure needs in the country. She has really solid connections, as I mentioned, with water utility groups. So I think she's a really good pick for the job. And I've worked with her for a number of years, and what she did for the U.S. Water Alliance, which is a coalition of utilities and NGOs, she really transformed that organization into one where I think everyone felt welcomed. And she found policy positions that everybody could get on board with, which is not all that easy in the water sector. So I think it's a really good pick. But no matter how good Michael Regan and Radhika Fox are, EPA is a bureaucracy. They can't act unilaterally. They're going to have to follow the law. They're going to have to follow process. And the fact remains that there are a lot of folks still at EPA that perhaps were reluctant in terms of what President Trump was doing, but ultimately they were faithful in executing his vision. And so they were complicit in, you know, a history at EPA that has been tarnished. And we need to rebuild confidence in EPA. And I think Radhika Fox and Michael Regan, we're going to have to rebuild confidence in EPA and confidence in science, which has been undermined over the last few years.
Great, thanks, Steve. That all sounds really promising. So an issue that we wanted to start with is something that we know is at the forefront of everyone's minds, which is the pandemic. How do you see this administration addressing water affordability and accessibility issues that have been exacerbated by the economic impacts of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic is a huge issue, as everyone knows, both from an economic standpoint, as well as from a personal human health and human lives standpoint. It's definitely important in terms of the context of water as well. You can't wash your hands and maintain good hygiene without running water. But in this country right now, under COVID and with such significant job losses, there are literally millions of people in this country that cannot pay their water bills. In California, for example, the State Water Board just came out with a report a week ago or so that 1.6 million households in California, that's about 5 million people, are behind on their water bills. 155,000 households owe more than $1,000 in back water bills. And the state says there's about $1 billion of household water debt in California alone. Now, when you multiply that across the entire country, you can see that those numbers are quite staggering. We've seen very significant numbers in places like Michigan and North Carolina, where they have compiled this information, like California. And people are really hurting financially. And if you can't pay your water bills, you run the risk of having your water shut off. Now, fortunately, California, Michigan, North Carolina, several states, there are shut-off moratoriums in place that basically do not allow utilities to shut off your water if you cannot pay right now. But that also creates a very difficult challenge for the utilities themselves. If they're not collecting these revenues, they face a real challenge in terms of operating their systems and the financial stability of their systems. And so people can't pay their water bills. Water systems are feeling the crunch because of that. And many small systems may fail because of that, because of financial insolvency or the inability to withstand the current situation. So in the last stimulus bill, there was $638 million that was put in there for federal assistance for low-income water and wastewater ratepayers to basically help them through the pandemic. About 50 to 60 million of that will come to California, as an example, to help offset people's bills. But we need to see a lot more of that in the COVID relief that's being discussed, because people just, the 50 to 60 million for California and the 638 million nationwide is not enough to keep people's water on and keep the utilities solvent in this challenge. And so President Biden has put forth in his rescue package, the $1.9 trillion rescue package that folks are talking about right now. He has put $5 billion in there for water and energy assistance for renters as part of a broader $30 billion rental assistance program. There's nothing in the Republicans' proposal on that. It's going to be really critical that stay in there and get pressed through. Senator Schumer was critical in getting the $638 million in the last package through. Vice President Harris has made some very encouraging statements on the human right to water. She has acknowledged that safe and sufficient and affordable water is a basic human right. She wrote a great op-ed in the Mercury News last summer with Dolores Huerta, an iconic civil rights activist here in California. And so she's committed to that as well, which is wonderful to see. But in this process that's taking place right now in Congress, it's pretty messy and it's unclear whether that's going to stay. We would love that money to be tied to a national shutoff moratoria that basically says, look, if you want the money to offset these underpayment of bills at the utility level, the utilities need to commit to shutoffs. I don't know that that's going to happen, but hopefully that money can stay in there. A lot of conversation happening around the stimulus right now. So the timing is right. A lot of people are looking to Senator Manchin from West Virginia, the Democrat from West Virginia. It's going to have enormous power in this conversation, since he's sort of the most conservative Democrat, if you will, in the Senate. Another challenge on this front in terms of the stimulus and where things are headed is the Trump impeachment trial, which is coming up next week. It doesn't look like the stimulus is going to go through before that, and that's going to delay things greatly. And as things get delayed, more people continue to suffer, more uncertainty in the system that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was a great discussion. President Biden has set out an ambitious climate plan. Does the plan include strategies for improving water infrastructure resilience, in particular to deal with water scarcity issues and to fortify infrastructure in coastal areas?
Yeah, I would say more so on flood resilience than on drought resilience, at least from what I can tell so far. On day one, in his executive order, he reinstated 2 Obama-era executive orders that were rescinded by President Trump. One of those relates to the federal flood protection standards, where federally funded infrastructure like public housing, hospitals, fire stations that may receive money, water treatment plants that may receive money from the federal government need to be built to a higher margin of safety to protect against extreme flooding and sea level rise. He also reinstated an executive order that makes climate resilience and adaptation a priority for all federal agencies. And that should include flooding as well as drought. There's opportunity in there for both when you think about climate resilience opportunities. In his climate executive order last week, water was mentioned 25 times, which was very encouraging. A lot of times people don't make the connection between climate change and water, and yet water is the tip of the spear in terms of how climate change is going to impact us. And we're going to feel it most acutely in the water sector through things like flooding and drought. So in this most recent executive order, there were a couple things in there. One, which is really as important, is what's called 30 by 30, which is a commitment to conserving at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, by the year 2030. And this is really important in terms of protecting wetlands, which serve as a buffer to sea level rise and climate change, both in the coastal context and as well as in the riverine context. So it's nice to see that as well. I've also seen some media reports that have been very encouraging in terms of opportunities at FEMA to make changes here and build climate resilience in on the front end, rather than spending so much federal money on the back end to clean up after disasters take place. Disaster mitigation, it's what they call, and you can put more resources on the front side to say, let's protect a community from flooding before the flooding even takes place. And there's a rule within FEMA that they're allowed to use a certain percentage of their funds for disaster preparedness. And because of the COVID relief money that's come in, the agency can recalculate how they distribute some of their disaster relief money on climate to disaster preparedness. And that could be, quite significant, on the tune of, $10 billion. So I'm very encouraged by that as well. And research shows that for every dollar the government spends on to protect a community before a disaster, they save $6 after the fact. So it's really good financial investment. We at NRDC have also filed a petition with FEMA just a couple weeks ago, before Biden took office, asking the agency to update its building and land use requirements within floodplains, and to develop new flood maps that project future flood risks based on climate change. It's something that a lot of these maps are really out of date and need to be updated to project the latest science on climate change and flood risks. And so we're hopeful that they'll grant that petition, but they at least have it, and they have all the science in front of them on that issue. On the drought side, again, agencies have an opportunity and a mandate now from the president to look at resilience that should include drought issues. There's also a couple rules that are under review by the agency that are subject to the first executive order to look back at what President Trump did in his last days. And there's been some litigation filed over the clothes washer rules for efficiency. Water efficiency is very closely tied to drought resilience. The more efficient and conserving we are in terms of how we use our water resources, the more resilient we can be in the context of drought. And the Trump administration had weakened some standards for clothes washers, for dishwashers. You probably all heard about toilets and shower heads. You know, that was one of his big rallying cries, was around how toilets are forcing him and people he knows to flush. You know, the modern efficient toilets are causing people to have to flush their toilets 10, 20 times, which is rather absurd. Those he succeeded in rolling back a number of those things, but a number of those things are already subject to litigation, and hopefully the agency will take another look at that and try to reverse course in terms of where President Trump had gone on those issues. The general feeling on the infrastructure stuff is that the COVID relief is going to move first, and then infrastructure will be discussed at Congress. Transportation may take the lead in that conversation, with water and other issues being lumped into a later infrastructure package. I don't know, a lot of details about that, but that's what folks are talking about this. The good news on the infrastructure investment side is that Senator Manchin, who I had mentioned is the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, he wants infrastructure funding. He wants a lot of it. And President Biden does too. And I think that bodes well for at least meaningful conversation in that space to try to close this infrastructure gap that this country is facing right now.
It's great. Thank you. Very, very illuminating. What initiatives might the new administration take with respect to contaminants of emerging concern, including these perfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS and PFOS? What do you see, for example, in the Safe Drinking Water Act context?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think PFAS and lead in drinking water in particular, I think those two are going to be big issues. And the reason I say that, one, is because so many parts of the country are confronted with problems associated with both PFAS pollution and lead in drinking water problems. But that also presents an opportunity for bipartisan support on these issues. And we've seen that in a number of places. In Michigan, for example, a lot of bipartisan support to try to address a PFAS pollution. And for those that don't know, PFAS is a chemical associated with a compound associated with non-stick pans, clothing that like Gore-Tex, and it's created real water quality problems around the country. And it's very toxic, and it lasts forever. It doesn't break down easily at all. During the presidential campaign, President Biden made a lot of promises around PFAS. He pledged to designate PFAS as a hazardous substance. He pledged to set a national drinking water standard for the chemical. And he pledged to invest in trying to identify substitutes for PFAS. There is Republican support, as I mentioned. Yesterday, it was very interesting. During Michael Regan's confirmation hearing, Senator Gillibrand asked him a number of questions about PFAS contamination that's of concern to her. He was very clear with her that he intended to set discharge limits and what he called water quality values, which I sort of assume he meant water quality standards on that. But when she asked him directly about drinking water standards, he seemed a little less clear in his answer on that. But Biden has already committed to that. And so, we intend to hold him to that commitment. Right before the inauguration, President Trump had announced that he would initiate a process to develop a national drinking water regulation around at least two individual compounds, PFAS and PFOA. Those are sort of the most well-known and most studied of the different variants of PFAS. that approach will take a long, long time, and we would much prefer to see something done as a class for PFAS, and we would much prefer that the administration, the Biden administration, use its expedited authority under what's called the Urgent Threats to Health Authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act, where they can set an interim drinking water standard rather quickly, rather than taking 10 years or longer to develop a standard, which, I don't think the public can wait for something like that. So that's what we see on the PFAS front, a conversation around that. On the lead in drinking water issue, before leaving office, President Trump issued a very, very bad update to the lead and copper rule, which hadn't been updated for quite some time. They tried to take a lot of credit for updating that, saying it hasn't been updated in a long time. Look at the good work we're doing here. But unfortunately, it wasn't a good job. It's a bad rule. They've allowed and extended the time, basically doubled the amount of time municipalities have to remove and utilities have to remove lead service lines, which still plague 6 to 10 million homes in the United States. And we all are familiar with the situation in Flint, Newark, Pittsburgh, where they've had real problems with lead service lines that have led to high levels of lead in their drinking water and are now being corrected. But still, many other parts of the country have enormous problems with lead service lines. Chicago, for example, probably has about 400,000 lead service lines still in use. And allowing 30 years to get those out of the system just puts 1-2 more generations of children at risk from high levels of lead exposure. They also refuse to set a maximum contaminant level for lead in school drinking water. There's an action level, but it's very difficult to enforce. Whereas a maximum contaminant level, you can actually enforce it. And there's nothing meaningful to protect kids at school from lead contamination, lead in schools. So we think there's an opportunity there for the Biden administration to do something. We sued over the Trump rule. They didn't hold hearings as required under the law prior to adopting that rule. So we think that hopefully we'll get the rule kicked out and give the Biden administration an opportunity to address it. On the drinking water side, another real critical part of the executive orders from President Biden has been, he's directed that 40% of overall benefits flow of investment, federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities. And that includes for critical drinking water infrastructure and clean water infrastructure. And we know for a long time that a lot of these problems plague Black and brown communities at much higher rates than they plague other communities. That goes for lead, that goes for the flooding issues. It's across the board. Water quality contamination problems are most acute in Black and brown communities, and they're least likely to be resolved through enforcement actions in Black and brown communities. And so that's a serious problem. And the Biden administration has made that statement, and hopefully we can hold them to that.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Our next question will be asked by Professor Alex Camacho.
Hi, thanks, Dave. And thanks, Steve, for your interesting responses to questions and your thoughts more generally. I guess my question relates to, I think, what often is considered the big elephant in the room for the Clean Water Act, and that is obviously the Waters of the United States rule. And I guess it would be useful to get a sense from you, what do you think we can expect to see from the administration in terms of that, particularly, but more broadly, I suppose? There are a lot of questions surrounding the fate of that rule, where the Trump administration, obviously, for those of you who don't know, the Waters of the United States rule is obviously the rule that sort of determines what waters are covered by the Clean Water Act, what counts as a federal jurisdictional water. And obviously, Trump administration narrowed that considerably, or at least has attempted to, leaving certain waters unprotected by federal law. What do you see happening at EPA and in the courts? And I guess even more broadly, do you have a sense of, this maybe it raises a sort of a broader prescriptive question about, is there anything that you see on the horizon to stop the sort of decades-long seesaw of trying to define the waters of the United States that we've been seeing literally for over a decade of this uncertainty regarding what qualifies? So any thoughts on that would be fantastic too.
Yeah, it's a great question, Alex. And yeah, the seesaw has been sort of been going on for 20 years. Much of my career, I've had to witness it. The waters of the U.S. it's an absolute mess, and it hasn't gotten any better since the Rapanos decision was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2006. There are many lawsuits still out there over the Obama rule and now the Trump rules, various Trump rules. Some are actually calling the waters of the U.S. conversation part of the culture wars of America. That's how really deep-rooted the debate over this issue of where the federal government should have jurisdiction over waterways. And just in terms of the impact that the Trump rule has had, more than 5,600 features like wetlands and ephemeral streams have been found to be non-jurisdictional since June when the rule came down. This is horrible news for our waterways. Under the Trump rule, under the dirty water rule, they basically adopted Justice Scalia's view at the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of an extremely narrow interpretation of federal jurisdiction over waterways. Ephemeral streams are out under their rules. Wetlands are not covered unless they abut or have a surface connection to navigable waters. And we're seeing miles and miles of streams and wetlands being denigrated just in single projects that are now qualified. So in terms of where we go, it's a very difficult conversation. I think congressional action would be the most helpful, as you can imagine, and that's sort of what the window of opportunity the Supreme Court invited many years ago with Swank in 2001 and then Rapanos' decision in 2006. It's going to be very difficult in Congress. I think, again, all eyes come back to Senator Manchin in West Virginia and whether there are 50 votes to move things. But with a filibuster still on these types of issues in Congress, very unlikely that Congress is actually going to be able to do anything. Representative DeFazio in the House has a bill that repeals the dirty water rule and directs the agencies to derive new rules under certain criteria. Just recently on the stimulus debate and the rescue package, Senator Moran just introduced an amendment to try to block EPA from spending any money to work on an update to the rule, or basically rescind the Trump dirty water rule. So, that's a conversation that's happening in Congress. But in terms of getting the votes to make something happen, very difficult with the filibuster in place. And that sort of then leaves things up to litigation. As I mentioned, there's a lot of cases out there. NRDC is involved in a number of them. Just last week, in response to the president's executive order, lawyers for EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Justice, requested a stay in litigation in a couple of the lawsuits that are out there right now. And I suspect that they'll do that in all the lawsuits to basically put that litigation on hold so that they can do a review of the Trump dirty water rule and assess whether or not it needs to be rescinded and taken back. That would then leave it up to the agency and what they might do in that context. And so, it was interesting to watch Michael Regan's confirmation hearing yesterday. He was asked about the WOTUS rule a number of times and what the agency might do in that context. He talked a fair bit about lessons learned since the 2015 clean water rule that Obama adopted. And so it seemed like he's very interested in addressing this issue. The good news is he has a very strong administrative record. You've got the 2015 rule, you got the whole record behind there and the more than 1,000 technical studies that were done on that. You've got the various administrative records through the Trump rules that came down and all the information that you can glean from that in terms of where the science is supposed to be around this. And so it seems like they're very well positioned to take another look at it. That doesn't really address your question of how do we deal with this seesaw back and forth? I think at some point the courts are going to have to decide this again if Congress is unwilling to act. And I think this administration, again, has a very strong administrative record that they could build something. It's going to take time, as it always does. They can't do things willy-nilly. They could pull the rules back by admitting error and that sort of thing in the court. But they can take another look at it and try to hew a little bit closer to what Justice Kennedy ruled in the Rapanos case. It was a 4-1-4 decision with Justice Kennedy in the middle, setting forth a significant nexus test, as you know, Alex. And they could hew a little closer to that. The Scalia test is nowhere near that. And then, that might withstand legal challenge in the courts. Most of the courts have interpreted the Kennedy test as being sufficient to grant jurisdiction. So I don't think that fight's over by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's going to go on for quite some time until once and for all, either the Supreme Court or Congress puts it to rest.
Can I just ask really quickly as a follow-up to that, Steve? Is there a way for the the Biden administration to piggyback off of the Obama administration's hard work, as you said, building that case, or is it sort of like they have to start from scratch?
No, I don't. Well, I mean, it would be a new rulemaking, I would think. Well, what they could do is just rescind. They have a number of options. They could just rescind the dirty water rule and the Trump rescission rule. It gets really complicated when you try to unwind all the pieces that are at play here. But they could just rescind those, and that would reinstate the Obama rule, and then the Obama rule would be subject to all the litigation and the stays and that are already out there, and that would have to proceed through the courts. So that's one tack they could take. They could take another tack and say, okay, let's pull this back. Let's pull everything back. Use all of the information we've collected, open it up again for public comment, take the best of all the ideas that we've seen from the Obama rule, the Trump rule, whatever we've learned from that process, and put it all together in one place. That's another option they could do. I don't know where Administrator Regan's head is on that, but he, when he signaled a lot of lessons learned, it's kind of like, okay, there's something that he's ruminating on in that context.
Great. Wonderful discussion, Steve. This is so illuminating and just full of wonderful information for us to continue to ponder. Not surprisingly, this discussion has prompted some really good questions from our audience participants. And I'll begin with one question that, first of all, thanks you for this terrific discussion. The question is, what are your views regarding the role of policy evaluation, and more specifically, cost-benefit analysis at EPA, considering issues such as environmental justice and co-benefits?
It's a really good question. And it's, there's sort of the macro level, and then there's the micro level. In certain contexts, cost-benefit analysis is perfectly appropriate and preferred in terms of how you assess things. In other contexts, it's not all that helpful in, say, protecting aquatic life or protecting human health. I think, when you set, for example, a water quality standard that's supposed to be designed to protect human health, cost-benefit analysis is not a factor there. It's purely an ecological or biological scientific evaluation as what do people need in order to be healthy? And then sometimes cost benefit comes in. Okay, now how do we apply that standard, that threshold of safety in the policy context? And sometimes cost benefit analysis comes into play in that context. I think one of the big challenges that we've had to endure over the years is oftentimes the costs, for example, for industry are considered, but the benefits to the public are not considered to the same extent in terms of public health and protecting public health and protecting communities from toxic pollution, whether it's in the water or the air context, or minimizing the value of a human life in those calculations. And that's a really serious problem. And so if we're going to look at cost benefit analysis, let's make sure that we understand the benefits of protecting human health, protecting human lives, protecting the planet, as in like climate change. People will talk about the costs of acting on climate change, but oftentimes fail to recognize the cost of not acting on climate change and the benefits of us having a sustainable planet to live on, and us having sustainable communities, and us protecting vulnerable populations who are critical to the fabric of this country and the fabric of society. And so we need to think about those considerations when we're looking at cost benefit analysis.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question from a participant in our audience regarding the COVID issue and what you alluded to before, Steve, about reducing water bills. And the question basically is this something that is generally only available in special situations like pandemics, or is this something that is or should be available at other times? This notion of alleviating the financial difficulties that people have in paying their water bills.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really varies around the country. It can vary, by your utility. It can vary by your municipality. It really speaks to the larger question of long-term affordability issues. And so we're seeing during COVID, some states, again, a very small section of states, who are providing relief from shutoffs. We are seeing some utilities we do know of utilities that have affordability programs and water discount programs for individuals, for low-income individuals. That does exist in some places. It's not as widespread, though, as it might be like in the energy sector, where they have low-income rate assistance programs, across the country that exists. To ensure people can pay their energy bills. And that might be either through a reduced energy bill or simply waiving the energy bill, usually in a reduced context. In the COVID context, basically, people are still accruing their bills. Even in California, where, for the most part, where the water is not being shut off, for the most part, people are still accruing their water bills. And the concern is that when the emergency is declared over, then utilities will be able to shut off the water if people don't pay those bills. Now, some utilities may have financial assistance programs to help offset those arrears, but it's not widespread, certainly not around the country. It's not widespread. And assistance and short-term assistance is not the same as affordability. And so, you can help someone pay their bill once, but if you structure your water rates in a way that ensures that based on income, people can afford to pay their water rates, that's much more helpful over the long term. And so that's something that's a part of the conversation. And you are seeing it in some legislative initiatives that are coming up nationally and in California. You're seeing folks talk about this a lot. How can we make water affordable, not just provide one-time assistance to help people with their water bills? But it's safe and affordable water is a human right. And it's important to have safe water, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to have clean water. And so it's a real critical issue that we have to address across this country.
Great, thank you very much. We have another question in the Q&A, actually a couple questions that have come in. One question makes the point that understandably, a lot is being done in the last couple of weeks by executive order. But what is the potential for getting new water-related federal legislation? Landmark legislation like the Clean Water Act has been used for years for water quality. What's on the horizon regarding new legislation, if any?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's sort of entwined into my response on the waters of the United States. In terms of landmark legislation, we haven't seen a landmark environmental law for quite some time, for decades. And it's a real challenge. The Clean Water Act's been around for 50 years. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary next year. It could use some updates. I'll admit that, particularly around agricultural runoff issues. But I don't think the prospects in this Congress are all that good. I think the House could easily move something, but the Senate, with the filibuster rule in place, I think it's near impossible to actually get some meaningful activity on that. Perhaps we could see something important on rural water issues. I think that presents opportunities more on a bipartisan basis to help folks in rural communities deal with both water pollution and water affordability issues, probably more on the affordability side. There's opportunity there. With the filibuster, I just don't see the Senate doing much on the legislative side. You could try to use the reconciliation process to get around it. But I think that's difficult. And again, you've got more moderate folks like Joe Manchin that you're going to have to appease with any proposal that you put on the table. Now, he's improved a lot in terms of his environmental voting record over the years. He used to not be a good vote on the environment, but in recent years he has come quite a long way in that regard. But I still think for something like the waters of the U.S. or some sort of landmark clean water legislation, it'd be very difficult unless you really came up with some brilliant idea that nobody's thought about over the last 50 years about how to correct this situation.
Great. And Alex has a question he'd like to ask you.
Yeah, sorry to keep dominating your question with some questions, but I thought one thing I think it would be great to get your sense of, Steve, is NRDC's role now and for the next 4 years. And in many ways, I'm a fellow for the Center for Progressive Reform, which is sort of a think tank that sort of advocates on behalf of environmental health and safety stuff. And a lot of times we realize we have a fundamentally different role sometimes when we have changes of administration. But I guess I wanted to get a sense from you whether you thought NRDC's role will be changing significantly, or in what ways may it be the same in terms of putting the current administration's feet to the fire, even though it is a more progressive administration than obviously the last one.
Yeah, well, I mean, the dynamic has changed a little bit. Hopefully we will not be filing as many lawsuits. I don't anticipate as many lawsuits. I mean, under the Trump administration, literally, we filed 140 lawsuits against the Trump administration. We prevailed in, of the cases that have been resolved at this point, we've prevailed in 90% of those cases.
That's better than the national record. I mean, the record is, I think this is the worst administration ever in terms of its track record, but it still was at about 20%. So you guys were beating the average in terms of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, they're doing abysmal, the previous administration. So, I think that dynamic is going to change. Hopefully we can have a much more constructive, I think we will have a much more constructive conversation around these issues and not have to be playing defense so much. But we do have to hold their feet to the fire. Again, they've made some pretty strong commitments to the environment, and on water in particular, where I work, they've made some pretty strong commitments, and I think it's incumbent on groups like ours to hold their feet to the fire on those commitments. They need to follow through, and you can make promises, but if you don't follow through, that's a whole different matter. And so we do have a critically important role to play there. I think groups like NRDC and other groups really need to remember that the whole game is not in Washington, D.C. And I think this goes to the prior question of sort of the need or what opportunities there might be for federal landmark federal legislation around water. The game can't just be within D.C. These issues impact people where they live, and change has to come at the local and state level. And so I think it's incumbent on groups like NRDC. We're a big group. We have a heavy national focus, but we really have to remember to double down on local and state activities to support change where it can happen. And if it's not going to happen at the federal level, it has to happen at the state and local level. And we have to be there to support frontline partners, environmental justice groups who are fighting those battles day in and day out with very limited resources. And I think, NRDC is committed to environmental justice issues. We have strong partnerships in a lot of places. We need to fortify those partnerships during the Biden administration. I personally don't think we should be shifting more resources to Washington. I think we should be building partnerships and power at local level and at the state level so we can really drive sustainable change. And maybe that's how we eventually get to landmark federal legislation to help break some of these bottlenecks, because there'd be a groundswell of energy around wanting to find change and secure change and protections for everybody all across the country.
It's a great segue actually to our next question, this notion of where people live and how it affects them immediately. Is there a role EPA headquarters can play in reducing inequalities in safe drinking water enforcement by states? And if so, what are some of the more concerning disparities in your view? And how could EPA headquarters help address these?
Yeah, we did a study a couple years ago about, particularly in the drinking water context, about drinking water violations and where those are most persistent around the country, and where those violations persist, even though they're known to be risks and violations in communities. And it's most acute, as I mentioned before, in Black and brown communities in this country. I think EPA has a really important role to play there. They have the national NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. I think I've talked to a number of folks on NEJAC recently. They're excited about the new administration, the new opportunities there, and the ability to embed environmental justice more deeply within the agency. There's conversation now about the White House and how it's going to embed environmental justice in terms of its operations and across the federal government. Big opportunities there to make sure that resources are directed towards those communities that are feeling the effects most acutely on the front lines. EPA does have the ability to do that, and they have the ability to provide oversights on the states to make sure that the states are cleaning up waterways in impacted communities, are enforcing the federal laws in impacted communities. The federal government has a lot of resources that they could redirect in that way. And with this commitment to ensure that 40% of our overall benefits flow to disadvantaged communities, President Biden has made that commitment, and he's going to have to follow through on that. And EPA has to be a critical player in making sure that happens. That's where they should be laser focused to make sure that there's never another Flint or another Newark anywhere in this country. It's a travesty. And if EPA is not going to do it, who's going to do it? The states need to do it, but sometimes they need some oversight to help make them abide by these requirements.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat, and it's more of a philosophical question about the role of regulation in general, I think. Notice the questioner notes that several industries are obviously struggling with COVID-19, that as environmental regulations are strengthened, costs can increase further, which could negatively impact businesses. How do we find a balance, I guess is the way I would phrase this. How could we find a balance between environmental regulations that affect the water industry and balance against these economic conditions that the nation is facing?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think it actually ties back to the environmental justice question as well. A lot of times, most of the time, polluting industries are in low-income communities. They're situated there. And so it becomes a question of equity. Should we in this country have two sets of standards? If you live in a wealthy community, your industry or your water utilities are held to a higher standard and you are entitled to clean water. But if you live in a poor community where industry may be struggling, you're not entitled to clean water. That is the wrong approach. That is an approach that is being promoted by some, although it's under the guise of, economic protection. I think we need to find ways to internalize the costs of production. These are externalities that are foisted on the community from industry and businesses. My personal opinion is, if you cannot compete in the marketplace without polluting your neighbors, maybe you shouldn't be in the marketplace. That's just my personal opinion. That's not NRDC's opinion. But we need to find a way that businesses who want to abide by the law can function properly and keep their community safe and keep the environment clean and move forward that way. But I think it's a very dangerous path to go back to go on, where we might have different sets of standards based on economic situations in different parts of the country. We need to make sure that there's COVID relief for business. Absolutely. People need to be, people are suffering, there's no question. And the federal government has a really important role to play in ensuring businesses withstand this, but that should not come at the cost of weakening standards that may put water quality at risk.
Steve, thank you very much. We only have a couple minutes remaining. Before I ask if you'd like to make some closing observations, your remarks make me think that at some point it would be a delight to have you back jointly between CLEANR and Water UCI, maybe a kind of a mid-course update on the progress that the Biden administration has made on water issues and the things that you've talked about. So just planting a seed, please think about that. I think that would be great if you could. With that, do you have any closing observations you'd like to share?
No, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. It's great to see all of you. I wish I could see all of the participants individually. I wish we could all meet in person. I hope everyone is staying safe. I hope your families are well. It's been a difficult year. We're all in this together. I think that's an important message. And even if we may have different political views, even if we may have different views on water policy, we really all are in this together. And I think in the end, if we can recognize that we all want to see each other safe and healthy, it will make for a better community for all of us. So thanks for having me. I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you for joining us, Steve. On behalf of the entire panel, on behalf of CLEANR, and on behalf of Water UCI, we can't thank you enough. This webinar has been recorded and will be available. So we'll make that available to you, and we will disseminate broadly the site it will be located at. It will be on the Water UCI homepage. And in addition, I wanted to remind you all that our next event will be a Water UCI event on February 25th at noon on water markets and water trading, an issue that's certainly becoming very timely. So please stay tuned for subsequent events, Water UCI and CLEANR and joint events. Steve, once again, a tremendous thank you for an illuminating discussion this afternoon. And thank you all participants for joining us in this wonderful webinar.